The summer I turned 24, I came home to find everything exactly the same and somehow completely different. My childhood bedroom still smelled like old wood and the lavender sachets my mother tucked into drawers. The wallpaper, faded blue with tiny sailing ships, hadn't changed since I was 8. Through my window, I could see the Hartwell house next door, its white shutters and wraparound porch as familiar as my own reflection. But something in the air felt charged, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when every blade of grass seems to hold its breath. I'd been away at college for 6 years, then graduate school, then a brief stint in Chicago that ended when my father had his heart attack. Now I was back in Cedar Falls, population 3,847, where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever really changed. Except it had, I had, and so had he, Marcus Hartwell. I saw him that first evening, just as the sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I was unpacking boxes on the back porch when movement caught my eye. There he was, walking across his yard, with that same easy stride I remembered. But his shoulders were broader now, his dark hair longer, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. He wore a faded blue t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees, and when he bent to pick up a fallen branch, I found myself staring at the way the fabric pulled across his back. We'd grown up side by side, our backyards separated by nothing more than a low wooden fence that had been more suggestion than barrier. As kids, we'd climbed over it countless times, treating both properties as one extended playground. Our mothers would call us in for dinner, and we'd race to see who could reach their back door first, laughing and breathless, grass stains on our knees and dirt under our fingernails. But suddenly, I couldn't recognize him in the same way. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. Danny? Danny Morrison? Is that really you? His voice, deeper now but still carrying that hint of laughter I remembered, made me look up from my boxes. He was standing at the fence, one hand resting on the weathered post. And when our eyes met, something shifted in my chest. A flutter, a recognition that went deeper than memory. Hey, Marcus. I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, suddenly aware of how I must look. Sweaty, disheveled, wearing the old Nirvana t-shirt I'd had since high school. When did you get so tall? He laughed, and the sound sent warmth spreading through me. When did you get so... He paused, his gaze traveling over me in a way that made my skin tingle. Different. Different. The word hung between us like a question neither of us was ready to answer. I walked over to the fence, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of sawdust and summer on his skin. He'd been working at his father's carpentry shop. I remembered my mother mentioning in one of her weekly phone calls. Building things with his hands, creating something solid and lasting from raw materials. You too. I said, and meant it. This wasn't the gangly teenager I'd left behind 6 years ago. This was a man with calloused hands and laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, with a way of looking at me that made me feel like he was seeing something I wasn't sure I was ready to reveal. We talked for a while about safe things. My father's recovery, his job, the changes in town. But underneath the surface conversation, something else was happening. The way he leaned against the fence, bringing us closer. The way his fingers drummed against the wood, drawing my attention to their length, their strength. The way he looked at my mouth when I spoke, as if he was reading something there beyond my words. As the sky deepened from gold to purple, he said, I should let you get back to unpacking. Yeah, I guess. But neither of us moved. A firefly blinked in the space between us, then another. Soon the air was full of them, tiny stars dancing in the growing darkness. Without thinking, I reached out to catch one, my hand brushing against his as he did the same thing. The contact was brief, electric, and when I pulled back, I could still feel the warmth of his skin against mine. Remember when we used to do this for hours? He asked softly. I did remember. Summer nights when we were 8, 9, 10 years old, running barefoot through the grass with mason jars, trying to capture magic in glass containers. My mother would watch from the kitchen window, smiling as we chased light through the darkness, our laughter carrying on the warm air. You always caught more than me, I said. I had longer legs. You still do. He smiled, and in the dim light, I could see something in his expression that hadn't been there when we were kids. Something aware, intent, patient. Like he was waiting for something, or maybe just letting something unfold naturally. Danny, he said, and the way he said my name made my heart skip. It's really good to have you home. Home. The words settled in my chest like something finding its proper place. The next few days fell into a rhythm I hadn't expected. I'd wake early, help my mother with breakfast, spend the morning job hunting online, and the afternoon organizing my father's medications and doctor appointments. But the evenings belonged to Marcus. It started innocently enough. I'd be on the porch with a beer, reading, or just watching the sunset, and he'd appear in his yard. Sometimes he was working on some project, fixing a fence post, watering the garden his mother had planted along the back of the house. Sometimes he was just there, as if drawn by the same invisible thread that seemed to pull me outside whenever I heard his screen door open. We'd end up talking across the fence, or he'd wander over and sit on the porch steps while I stayed in the swing my father had hung when I was 12. The conversations were easy, comfortable, like slipping into clothes that fit perfectly. We talked about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, movies we'd seen, the places we'd been, and the places we wanted to go. He told me about college in Vermont, about studying environmental science and spending summers fighting forest fires in Montana. I told him about graduate school, about the brief relationship that had ended badly, about the job in Chicago that had felt like wearing someone else's life. But underneath the words, something else was building, a tension that made the air between us feel thick and charged. The way he'd lean forward when I was talking, elbows on his knees, giving me his complete attention. The way I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze soft and considering. The way we'd both go quiet sometimes, letting the silence stretch between us like a bridge we weren't quite ready to cross. One evening, about a week after I'd been home, we were sitting on the porch as usual. The air was thick with humidity and the promise of rain, and every so often, lightning would flicker in the distance without any thunder. Marcus was telling me about a house his father was building out on Route 9. His hands moving as he described the way they'd had to work around a massive oak tree the owners had refused to cut down. I found myself watching his hands more than listening to his words. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered and strong, with calluses on the palms and a thin scar across the knuckles of his right hand from some childhood accident I couldn't quite remember. When he gestured, emphasizing a point, I had to resist the urge to reach out and trace the lines of his fingers, to feel the texture of his skin under mine. "You're not listening," he said suddenly, and I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sorry, I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I'd been thinking without revealing too much. "Just what?" Heat crept up my neck. "Distracted." "By what?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibility. I could have deflected, made a joke, changed the subject. Instead, I heard myself say, "By you." Something shifted in his expression. A slight parting of his lips, a deepening of the focus in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair studying me, and I felt exposed, like he could see every thought I'd been trying to hide. "Danny?" he said softly, and my name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Like a question, like a promise. Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer now, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. We should have gone inside, but neither of us moved. The rain fell harder, drumming against the porch roof, creating a curtain of sound that seemed to wrap around us, making the world beyond the porch feel very far away. "I should go," he said, but he didn't stand up. "Probably," I agreed, but I didn't suggest he leave. Instead, we sat there in the warm, rain-scented air, looking at each other across the small space that felt both infinite and non-existent. His t-shirt was damp from the few drops that had blown onto the porch, and I could see the outline of his chest beneath the thin fabric. When he ran a hand through his hair, pushing the dark strands back from his forehead, I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from reaching out to touch him. "This is," he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "What?" "Different," he said, echoing his words from that first night. "This whole thing. Being here with you, it's different than I thought it would be." "Different how?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much to reveal. "When we were kids," he said finally, "I used to wish you'd never grow up and leave. I thought if I could just keep you here in this place, everything would stay the same forever." "That's impossible," I said gently. "I know." He smiled, but there was something sad in it. "And I'm glad it is, because this version of you, The man you've become?" He shook his head. I couldn't have imagined this. The rain was lessening now, the thunder moving off toward the east, but the air still felt electric, charged with more than just the storm. I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to push for clarity, but I was afraid of breaking whatever spell had settled over us. Instead, I said, "I used to think about you sometimes when I was away." "Yeah? Wonder what you were doing. Whether you were happy, whether you'd changed. And now that you're back, what do you think?" I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the way the dim porch light caught the angles of his face, the way he was sitting forward slightly, as if he was leaning into my answer. "I think," I said carefully, "that you're exactly who you were supposed to become." Something in his expression softened. "Danny." The way he said my name, so quietly, so full of something I couldn't quite name, made my heart race. We were both leaning forward now, the space between us smaller than it had ever been, and I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could catch the scent of rain and sawdust and something uniquely him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the moment. He pulled it out, glanced at it, and sighed. "My mom, I should—" "Of course." He stood, but he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he looked down at me, and I could see him struggling with something, some decision or realization. "Danny," he said finally, would you want to do something tomorrow night? Just us?" "What did you have in mind?" "There's something I want to show you, something I found a few weeks ago, but it would mean staying out late, and—" "I'm in," I said before he could finish. He smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out. "Good. I'll pick you up at 8. I'll be ready." After he left, I sat on the porch for another hour, listening to the last drops of rain pattering against the leaves and trying to understand what was happening to me. To us. The rational part of my brain insisted this was just nostalgia, just the comfort of reconnecting with an old friend. But my body knew better. My body was humming with a kind of awareness I'd never felt before, not even in my most serious relationship. When I finally went inside, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes were bright, almost fevered, and there was a flush in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm evening air. I looked like a man on the verge of something, something that might change everything. I spent the next day distracted, going through the motions of my responsibilities while my mind kept drifting to Marcus. To the way he'd looked at me on the porch, to the promise of whatever he wanted to show me that night. My mother commented twice that I seemed somewhere else entirely, and she wasn't wrong. By 7:30, I'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on jeans and a button-down shirt I'd bought in Chicago, but never worn. I told myself I wasn't dressing for him, but the lie felt thin even to me. He knocked on the front door at exactly 8 o'clock, and when I opened it, I had to take a step back. He was wearing dark jeans and a white t-shirt under a flannel shirt, simple clothes that somehow made him look impossibly handsome. His hair was still damp from a shower, and I could smell soap and something else, something warm and clean that made me want to step closer. "Ready?" he asked. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." His truck was the same beat-up Ford he'd been driving in high school, but he'd clearly taken care of it. The interior was clean, the radio tuned onto a station that played the kind of music we'd listened to as teenagers. As we drove through town, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood, I felt like I was moving through a dream version of my own life. We drove for about 20 minutes, past the town limits and into the countryside, following roads that grew progressively narrower and more winding. The landscape was exactly as I remembered it. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses, fields of corn and soybeans, patches of forest that seemed untouched by time. But seeing it all with Marcus beside me, seeing it through his eyes as he pointed out changes I'd missed, made it feel new again. "Turn here," he said, indicating a dirt road I'd never noticed before. The road wound through a stand of maple and oak trees, their leaves forming a canopy overhead that filtered the last light of day into shifting patterns of gold and green. After a few minutes, the trees opened up, and I saw where he was taking me. A lake. Not the big recreational lake on the other side of town where families went to swim and boat, but something smaller, more private. The water was dark as glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Cattails grew along the edges, and a fallen log stretched partway into the water like a natural dock. "How did you find this place?" I asked as we got out of the truck. "I was hiking a few weeks ago and got lost," he said, pulling a blanket and a cooler from the truck bed. "Ended up here by accident. I've been coming back ever since." We walked down to the water's edge, and he spread the blanket on a patch of grass near the fallen log. The cooler contained beer and sandwiches, simple food that somehow felt perfect in this setting. As we ate, we talked about memories, about the places we'd explored as kids, about the way the landscape held our history like rings in a tree. But as the sun set and the first stars appeared, the conversation began to shift. We talked about loneliness, about the feeling of not quite fitting in anywhere, about the strange experience of coming home after being away and finding that both you and home had changed in ways you couldn't quite quantify. I used to think there was something wrong with me, Marcus said, lying back on the blanket and looking up at the stars. The way I never seemed to want what other people wanted. The way relationships felt like I was pretending to be someone else. I lay down beside him, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body but not quite touching. What do you mean? I don't know. Like I was always waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. And then everyone else seemed to know exactly what they wanted, and I felt like I was missing some crucial piece of information. I knew exactly what he meant, but I wasn't sure I was ready to say so. Instead, I said, maybe the problem wasn't that you didn't know what you wanted. Maybe it was that you knew, but you were afraid to admit it. He turned his head to look at me, and in the starlight, his expression was serious, searching. What about you? Did you ever feel like that? All the time, I admitted, especially in Chicago. I had this job, this apartment, this life that looked right from the outside, but every day felt like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit, like I was playing a part in someone else's story. And now? I looked at him, at the way the starlight caught in his eyes, at the way his shirt had pulled up slightly, revealing a strip of skin at his waist. Now I feel like I'm waking up. We were quiet for a while, listening to the gentle lap of water against the shore, the distant call of a nightbird. The air was warm and still, filled with the scent of water and growing things. It was the kind of night that felt suspended outside of time where anything seemed possible. Danny, Marcus said softly, and I could hear something different in his voice, something vulnerable. Can I tell you something? Of course. When we were kids, I had this fantasy, this stupid, impossible fantasy. What was it? He was quiet for so long, I thought he'd change his mind about telling me. Then, in a voice so low I had to strain to hear him, he said, I used to imagine that someday when we were older, we'd run away together, just disappear one night and never come back. Go somewhere where no one knew us, where we could be whoever we wanted to be. That doesn't sound stupid, I said. It felt stupid then. A kid's fantasy. But lying here with you now, he turned onto his side, facing me, and I could see the struggle in his expression. It doesn't feel stupid anymore. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. We were lying less than a foot apart, close enough that I could count his eyelashes, could see the slight parting of his lips as he breathed. The air between us felt charged, electric with possibility and fear and something I was finally ready to name. Marcus, I said, and his name felt different on my tongue, fuller, more meaningful. Yeah? What are you trying to tell me? He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. His fingers brushed against mine where my hand lay on the blanket between us, and the contact sent electricity shooting up my arm. I'm trying to tell you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, then that coming home wasn't the only reason I never left Cedar Falls. The implication of his words hit me like a physical force. All those years, all those visits home from college, where we'd hung out like old friends, catching up, maintaining the careful distance of people who'd grown apart. Had he been feeling this too? This pull, this recognition, this sense that we were circling around something neither of us had been ready to name? Marcus, I started, but I didn't know how to finish. I know, he said. I know it's complicated. I know we have history and our families, and I don't want to mess up what we have. But I also can't pretend anymore that seeing you again hasn't changed everything for me. I stared at him, at this man who'd been part of my life for as long as I could remember, and felt something click into place. Like a puzzle piece I'd been carrying around for years, finally finding where it belonged. You're not the only one it's changed, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Hope. Maybe, or relief. Yeah? Yeah. I turned onto my side to face him fully, and now we were so close our breath was mingling in the space between us. I keep trying to figure out when it happened. When I stopped seeing you as my childhood friend and started seeing you as this. This? The person I can't stop thinking about. The person who makes my heart race just by saying my name. The person I've been waiting for without even knowing I was waiting. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. God, Danny, do you have any idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that? We were so close now that when he spoke, I could feel his breath against my lips. Everything in me was screaming to close that last inch of distance, to find out what it would feel like to kiss him. To finally cross the line we'd been dancing around. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was the weight of all our history, maybe it was just the knowledge that once we took this step, there would be no going back. I'm scared, I whispered. Me too, he whispered back. But I'm more scared of not taking the chance. We lay there in the starlight, poised on the edge of something that would change everything, and I could feel the future splitting into before and after. Before this moment and after this moment. Before this realization and after this realization. Before us and after us. This summer, he said softly, his eyes searching mine, it feels different, doesn't it? The question hung in the air between us like a bridge, like an invitation, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed for far too long. I could see in his expression that he was asking about more than just the summer, more than just the heat and the long days and the way the light lingered past 8 o'clock. He was asking about us, about this thing that was building between us, about whether I felt it too, this shift, this recognition, this sense that everything we thought we knew was changing. I opened my mouth to answer, to tell him, yes, it did feel different. Everything felt different. I felt different when I was with him. But the words caught in my throat, too big and too fragile to release into the night air. Instead, we lay there in the silence that followed his question, both of us afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any response might shatter whatever was building between us. Part 2, the silence stretched between us like a held breath. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human drama playing out on the blanket below. A night bird called somewhere in the darkness, its voice liquid and haunting, and still neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of his question settling over us like fog, changing the very air we breathed. This summer, it feels different, doesn't it? The words echoed in my mind, heavy with everything he wasn't quite saying, everything I wasn't quite ready to hear. Finally, I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the sky, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He was as afraid as I was, I realized, as terrified of this moment and as desperate for it. Marcus, I whispered. He turned toward me, and in the starlight, his face was all shadows and plains, beautiful and foreign and heartbreakingly familiar all at once. We were lying so close now that I could count the freckles scattered across his cheekbones, could see the way his lips were slightly parted, as if he was about to speak. Yeah, I said finally, so quietly the words were barely more than breath. It does feel different. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or fear, or both. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were bright with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I was so afraid you'd say no, he said, that you'd tell me I was imagining things. You're not imagining anything. We were facing each other now, lying on our sides in the warm grass beside the dark water. The space between us was no more than a few inches, but it felt infinite and non-existent all at once. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could catch the scent of his soap and something else, something uniquely him that made my chest tight with longing. Danny, he said, and the way he said my name made my heart skip. What are we doing? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything we'd been dancing around for weeks. What were we doing? Two childhood friends lying beside a hidden lake, suspended between past and future, between friendship and something else entirely. Two men who'd grown up in neighboring houses, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and difference was dangerous. I don't know, I said honestly, but I don't want to stop. He reached out then, slowly giving me time to pull away. His fingers brushed against mine where my hand lay on the blanket between us, and the contact sent electricity shooting up my arm. Such a small touch, barely more than an accident, but it felt monumental, like crossing a line we'd been walking for our entire lives. I keep thinking about when we were kids, he said, his voice soft in the darkness. All those summers, all those nights catching fireflies in the backyard. We were always together, always finding excuses to be near each other. I thought it was just friendship, but now, Now I wonder if I was lying to myself, if some part of me always knew. I thought about those summer nights he was remembering. The way we'd run through the grass with mason jars, our bare feet silent on the warm earth. The way we'd collapse afterward, breathless and laughing. Lying side by side on the blanket my mother would spread under the old oak tree. How we'd point out constellations we'd learned in school, our hands sometimes brushing as we gestured toward the sky. Had I felt it then? That pull, that sense of rightness when we were together? Or was I, like him, rewriting history through the lens of this new understanding? I used to hate when summer ended, I said. Not just because of school, but because I knew the rhythms would change. No more long days outside, no more excuses to spend every waking moment together. You felt it too. I don't know what I felt. I just knew that everything was better when you were there. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him processing this, turning it over in his mind like a stone he'd found on the beach. And now? Now I know why. The admission hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I'd never said anything like it before, never allowed myself to even think it so clearly. But lying there with him, with the stars reflecting in the dark water and the night air soft around us, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We'd lived only a few feet apart our whole lives, but right then it felt like crossing that distance might change everything. Can I? He started, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across his face. What? Can I touch you? I want to know if this is real. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he reached out again. This time, instead of just brushing my fingers, he took my hand in his, threading our fingers together. His palm was warm and slightly rough from work, and I could feel the calluses on his fingertips, the thin scar across his knuckles. It was such an ordinary touch, the kind friends might share, but it felt like the most intimate thing I'd ever experienced. Is this okay? He whispered. More than okay. We lay like that for a while, hands linked, shoulders almost touching, neither of us speaking. The silence was comfortable now, charged, but not urgent. It felt like we had all the time in the world, like this moment could stretch indefinitely, and we'd be content to let it. But eventually the spell was broken by the distant sound of a screen door slamming. Somewhere across the lake, a porch light flickered on, and we could hear the faint sound of someone calling a dog inside for the night. The ordinary sounds of other people's lives, carrying across the water to remind us that the world existed beyond this blanket, beyond this moment. Marcus sat up first, reluctantly releasing my hand. We should probably head back. It's getting late. I wanted to protest, to say that late didn't matter, that nothing mattered except this feeling between us. But I knew he was right. We both had responsibilities, families who might worry if we were gone too long. And maybe, if I was being honest, I needed time to process what was happening, to understand what it meant for everything I thought I knew about myself. The drive back was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The radio played softly, and occasionally Marcus would point out something. A deer at the edge of a field, the way the moon looked through the trees. But mostly, we were lost in our own thoughts, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. When we pulled into my driveway, he didn't immediately get out to walk me to the door like he had when we were teenagers. Instead, he sat there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. Danny, he said finally, about tonight, yeah? I don't want you to think I planned this. I hoped, but I didn't plan to say all that. I'm glad you did. He turned to look at me, and even in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see the vulnerability in his expression. Are you? Really? Really? He smiled then, and it was like watching the sunrise. Good, because I have no idea what happens next, but I know I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. Neither do I. I got out of the truck, but before I could close the door, he called my name. When I turned back, he was leaning across the seat, his face serious. Sweet dreams, Danny. The way he said it, soft and intimate, made heat pool in my stomach. You too. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the corner, and then stood in my driveway for a long time, looking up at the stars and trying to understand how everything had changed in the span of a single evening. The next few days fell into a pattern that was both new and familiar. We didn't talk about what had happened at the lake, but it was there between us in every glance, every casual touch, every moment of shared silence. It was as if we'd opened a door that couldn't be closed again, even though neither of us was quite ready to walk through it. Marcus started finding excuses to come over more often. He'd offer to help with yard work, or bring over tomatoes from his mother's garden, or stop by to check on my father's recovery. Each visit felt charged with possibility, every interaction layered with meaning that would have been invisible to an outside observer but felt monumental to us. One afternoon, he was helping me paint the back porch, a project my mother had been nagging me about since I got home. We worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft whisper of brushes against wood and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a section near my left shoulder. I turned to look, and he stepped closer to show me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body against my back. His hand brushed mine as he guided the brush to the right spot, and the simple contact sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "There," he said softly. But he didn't step away. I turned in the small space between him and the porch rail, and suddenly we were facing each other. So close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Paint was smudged on his cheek, and without thinking, I reached up to brush it away with my thumb. The moment my skin touched his, everything else fell away. The world narrowed to just this: the warmth of his cheek under my thumb, the way his breath caught, the way his eyes darkened as he looked at me. We were both perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over us. "Danny," he whispered. "Yeah?" But before he could say whatever he'd been about to say, we heard the slam of a car door from the front of the house, followed by my mother's voice calling my name. We sprang apart like teenagers, caught doing something wrong, putting distance between us that felt artificial and necessary all at once. "Coming, Mom," I called back, my voice hopefully steadier than I felt. Marcus had picked up his brush again and was painting with careful concentration, but I could see the flush in his cheeks, the slight tremor in his hands. When my mother appeared around the corner of the house, arms full of grocery bags, we both turned to her with expressions that were probably a little too bright, a little too casual. "Oh, hello, Marcus," she said, smiling at him with the warmth she'd always shown him. "How nice of you to help Danny with this. It's been on my list for months." "Happy to help, Mrs. Morrison," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal. "Danny's doing most of the work. I'm just here for moral support." She laughed and headed inside, but not before shooting me a look I couldn't quite interpret. When she was gone, Marcus and I finished the painting in silence, both of us hyper-aware of every movement, every breath, every moment when our bodies came close to touching. That evening, as we cleaned brushes in the backyard, he said quietly, "We can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Pretending this is normal. Pretending we're just friends helping each other with chores." I set down the brush I'd been cleaning and looked at him. He was right, of course. The tension between us was becoming impossible to ignore, and I was starting to worry that other people would notice. My mother, his parents, the neighbors who'd watched us grow up and thought they knew everything about us. "What do you want to do about it?" I asked. "I don't know. Talk about it, maybe. Figure out what this means." "Okay, when? Tonight? We could go for a drive, find somewhere private to—" "Danny?" My mother's voice came from the back door. "Could you help me with something inside?" We looked at each other, and I could see my own frustration reflected in his expression. It felt like the universe was conspiring to keep us from having the conversation we needed to have, from crossing whatever line we were circling. "Rain check?" I said. "Rain check." But as he gathered his things to leave, he caught my hand for just a moment, his fingers squeezing mine in a gesture that was brief but loaded with promise. "Soon," he said, and it sounded like a vow. The rain check turned into a week of near misses and interrupted moments. Every time we tried to find time alone, something interfered. His father needed help with a job that ran late. My mother decided to have friends over for dinner. A summer storm knocked out power for half the neighborhood, and we spent the evening helping elderly neighbors instead of talking about whatever was happening between us. It was maddening and sweet all at once, like being 16 again, but with the weight of a dulled understanding. Every stolen glance, every casual touch, every moment of shared laughter felt precious and fragile. I found myself looking forward to the smallest interactions, passing him a glass of water, having him help me carry something heavy, catching his eye across a room, and seeing my own feelings reflected there. We developed a language of small gestures, a hand on a shoulder that lingered a beat too long, fingers brushing when we reached for the same thing, the way he'd look at me when he thought no one else was paying attention, his gaze soft and considering and full of something I was learning to recognize as longing. The problem was that everyone else seemed to be paying attention. My mother started making comments about how nice it was that Marcus and I had reconnected, with a tone that suggested she was reading more into our friendship than she was saying. His mother, Mrs. Hartwell, began inviting me over for dinner with increasing frequency, and I caught her watching us with the kind of knowing smile that made my stomach clench with anxiety. One evening, about 2 weeks after the night at the lake, I was sitting on the front porch reading when Marcus appeared at the end of our driveway. He looked agitated, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as nervous energy. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked without preamble. I set down my book and followed him down the street, past houses where we'd trick-or-treated as children, past the corner where we'd learned to ride bikes, past the park where we'd played countless games of pickup basketball. The familiarity of it all felt surreal, like we were walking through a museum of our own childhood while carrying the weight of this new understanding between us. We ended up at the old elementary school playground, deserted now in the early evening light. Marcus sat down on one of the swings, and I took the one next to him, our chains creaking softly as we rocked back and forth. "My mom asked me something today," he said finally. "What?" "She wanted to know if I was dating anyone, said I seemed different lately, happier, but also distracted." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I wasn't dating anyone." He paused, looking out across the empty playground. "But she kept pushing, said I had the look of someone with a secret." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his mother's observation settling between us. It was one thing to navigate our own feelings, but the idea that other people were starting to notice made everything feel more complicated, more dangerous. "Danny," he said quietly, "what are we going to do?" It was the same question he'd asked at the lake, but it felt different now, more urgent, less about understanding what was happening between us, and more about figuring out how to handle it in the real world. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I keep thinking about what happens when people start asking questions we can't answer." "You mean questions we can't answer? Or questions we're not ready to answer?" The distinction was important, and we both knew it. I thought about his mother's knowing smile, about the way my own mother had been watching us with increasing interest, about this small town where secrets were hard to keep and difference was met with everything from curiosity to hostility, depending on who was doing the judging. "Both, maybe," I said. He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "I've been thinking about that too, about what it would mean if we—" He trailed off, but I knew what he was trying to say. "If we what?" "If we stop pretending this is just friendship." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. If we stopped pretending. If we acknowledged what was building between us. If we took the step from almost to actually, from maybe to yes. "Are you ready for that?" I asked. I don't know if anyone's ever ready for something like this, but I know I'm tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel. "And what do you feel?" He turned to look at me, and in the golden light of the setting sun, his expression was open and vulnerable and beautiful. Like I've been waiting my whole life for this summer, for you to come home, for us to finally see each other clearly. My heart clenched at the honesty in his voice, at the way he was laying himself bare despite the risk. "Marcus, I know it's complicated. I know there are a million reasons why this is a bad idea, but I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." The swing set creaked as a breeze picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that had shaded this playground for as long as I could remember. I thought about all the times we'd played here as children, racing across the monkey bars, pushing each other on these same swings, existing in that innocent space where the future was an abstract concept and feelings were simple, uncomplicated things. "I feel the same way," I said quietly, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need or what I need or how to navigate any of it without hurting people we care about." He reached over and took my hand, linking our fingers the way he had that night by the lake. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out at once. Maybe we just have to figure out the next step." "What is the next step?" "I don't know, but I know I want to take it with you." We sat there as the sun finished setting, hands linked, swings moving gently in the evening breeze. Around us, the sounds of suburban evening began to emerge. Screen doors opening, parents calling children inside, the distant sound of a television through an open window, the ordinary sounds of other people's lives, carrying on while our own felt suspended in possibility. "We should get back," I said finally. before people start wondering where we are. Yeah, he agreed, but neither of us moved to stand up. Instead, we sat for a few more minutes, holding hands in the growing darkness, both of us reluctant to let go of this moment. When we finally walked back through the familiar streets, we kept a careful distance between us, but I could feel the invisible thread that connected us, stretched taut with longing and possibility and fear. The weeks that followed were a study in controlled tension. We found ways to see each other, helping with various household projects, meeting for coffee at the diner downtown, taking long walks through the countryside, but always in contexts that felt safe, explicable, normal. To outside observers, we were just childhood friends reconnecting. Two men in their 20s enjoying the familiarity of home. But underneath the surface, something was building. Every conversation felt layered with meaning, every casual touch charged with electricity. We developed an almost telepathic awareness of each other's moods, could read volumes in a glance across a room. When he was working in his yard, I found myself gravitating toward windows that faced his house. When I was on the porch, he always seemed to appear in his own backyard, as if drawn by the same invisible force. The physical space between us began to feel like a living thing. When we sat together, on the porch steps, at the diner, in his truck when he drove me somewhere, I was hyper-aware of every inch that separated us. The warmth radiating from his body, the way he smelled like sawdust and soap and something uniquely him, the way his hand would rest on the gear shift between us, so close I could have touched it without moving more than a few inches. One afternoon in late July, we were at the hardware store downtown, ostensibly shopping for supplies to fix my father's back steps. The store was old and cramped, with narrow aisles that forced people to brush past each other constantly. Marcus was reaching for something on a high shelf, his t-shirt riding up to reveal a strip of tan skin, when another customer tried to squeeze past us. "Excuse me," the man said, and Marcus stepped closer to me to make room. Suddenly, we were pressed together in the small space, his chest against my back, his breath warm against my neck. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but I felt every moment of contact like a brand. When he stepped away, his hand brushed against my arm, and I saw something flicker in his expression that told me he'd felt it too. "Sorry," he said quietly, but his eyes said something different entirely. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying those 3 seconds over and over again. The weight of his body against mine, the way he'd smelled like sun and work and something indefinably masculine. The brief moment when his hand had lingered on my arm, before propriety forced him to pull away. I was 24 years old, and I'd been with people before. I'd had relationships, physical and emotional connections that had felt meaningful at the time, but nothing had ever affected me the way those few seconds of accidental contact with Marcus had. Nothing had ever made me feel so desperate and terrified and alive all at once. The next morning, I found him in his backyard, working on what looked like a new fence post. He was shirtless in the heat, his skin golden from weeks of summer sun, and I had to grip the porch railing to steady myself. "Morning," I called, trying to sound casual. He looked up and smiled, shading his eyes with one hand. "Morning. Sleep okay?" "Fine," I lied. "You?" "Like a baby," he said, but something in his expression suggested otherwise. I walked over to the fence that separated our properties, the same fence we'd climbed over countless times as children. Now it felt like a barrier, a physical representation of all the things we couldn't say, couldn't do, couldn't be. "Need any help with that?" I asked, nodding toward the post. "I've got it, but thanks." He paused, then added, "Actually, could you hand me that level? It's right there behind you." I turned to look for the tool, and when I turned back, he was right at the fence line, close enough to touch. I handed him the level, and our fingers brushed as he took it. Such a small contact, barely worth noting, but it sent electricity shooting up my arm. "Thanks," he said, not stepping back. "No problem." We stood there for a moment, facing each other across the low fence, and I could see my own longing reflected in his eyes. The morning was already warm, but I felt heat that had nothing to do with the weather. His gaze traveled from my eyes to my mouth and back again, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the same invisible force that had been pulling us together all summer. "Danny," he said quietly. "Yeah? We're going to drive each other crazy if we keep this up." "I know, but I can't seem to stop. Neither can I." He reached out then slowly, giving me time to pull away. His fingertips traced along my jaw. Such a light touch it was barely there, but it made me close my eyes and lean into the contact. Marcus, I started, but the sound of a car door slamming made us both jump apart. His mother was getting out of her car in their driveway, arms full of grocery bags. If she'd seen us, she gave no indication, but we both stepped back from the fence like we'd been burned. Hi, Mrs. Hartwell, I called, hoping my voice sounded normal. Hello, Danny. How's your father feeling? Much better, thanks. She headed into the house, and Marcus and I looked at each other across the fence. The moment was broken, but the electricity between us still hummed in the air. We should probably, he said. Yeah. But neither of us moved. We stood there in the morning sun, separated by 3 feet of space and a wooden fence and all the complications of family and history and small town expectations. Both of us, knowing we were balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. As July bled into August, the heat became oppressive, the kind of humid, sticky heat that made everyone short-tempered and drove people indoors during the hottest parts of the day. But somehow, Marcus and I seemed to thrive in it. We'd meet in the early evenings when the worst of the heat had passed, walking the shaded paths that wound through the woods behind the elementary school, or driving out to the lake to skip stones across the dark water. These excursions began to feel like stolen time, precious hours when we could exist in our own private world. We talked about everything and nothing, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, memories from childhood that took on new meaning now that we were seeing them through different eyes. But underneath every conversation was the awareness of what we weren't saying, what we weren't doing, what we were both desperately wanting. One evening in mid-August, we were walking along the creek that ran behind the old mill, the same creek where we'd caught minnows and built dams as children. The sun was setting through the trees, casting everything in golden light, and the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of insects beginning their evening chorus. Remember when we used to pretend this was the Amazon? Marcus said, gesturing toward the narrow stream that had seemed so vast in our childhood imagination. And you were convinced there were piranhas in it. I was 8, and Joey Patterson told me he'd seen them. Joey Patterson also told you his dad was secretly a spy. Marcus laughed, and the sound made something warm unfurl in my chest. Good point. I was pretty gullible. You were imaginative. There's a difference. We found a fallen log and sat down, our feet dangling toward the water. The creek gurgled softly below us, and somewhere in the distance, a screen door slammed and a mother called her children in for dinner. The sounds of other people's lives carrying on their normal routines while we sat in this pocket of suspended time. I've been thinking, Marcus said after a while, and about what? About what you said that night at the lake, about feeling like you were wearing clothes that didn't fit when you were in Chicago. I nodded, remembering that conversation. It felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a few weeks. I think I know what you meant now, he continued. I've felt like that my whole life, like I was playing a part that everyone expected me to play, but it never felt real, never felt like me. And now? He turned to look at me, and in the fading light, his expression was soft and open. Now I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was always supposed to be. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I knew he wasn't just talking about some general process of self-discovery. He was talking about this, about us, about the way being together had awakened something in both of us that we'd never allowed ourselves to acknowledge before. Marcus, I said quietly, what happens when summer ends? It was the question we'd both been avoiding, but it felt important to name it. In a few weeks, the lazy rhythms of summer would give way to fall routines. I'd need to find a job, start building a life here that extended beyond these stolen moments. The urgency of harvest season would keep Marcus busier at his father's shop. The comfortable bubble we'd been living in would pop, and we'd be forced to figure out how this thing between us fit into the real world. I don't know, he said honestly. I keep trying not to think about it. But you have been thinking about it. Yeah. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. I keep wondering if this is just a summer thing. If maybe we're both just, I don't know, nostalgic or lonely or something, and when real life starts again, we'll realize we were kidding ourselves. The possibility sent a chill through me, even in the warm evening air. Is that what you think this is? No, he said quickly. God, no, but I worry that's what you'll think, or what other people will think, or that the pressure of trying to figure out how to make this work in the real world will kill whatever we have. I understood his fear because I shared it. This thing between us felt so fragile, so precious, so unlike anything either of us had experienced before. The thought of subjecting it to the harsh light of day, to the scrutiny and expectations of family and friends and a community that might not understand, was terrifying. But the alternative, pretending it didn't exist, going back to being just neighbors, just childhood friends, felt impossible. I don't want this to end, I said. Neither do I. So what do we do? He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing options, calculating risks, trying to find a path through the maze of complications that surrounded us. Maybe, he said finally, we stop trying to figure out the rest of our lives and just focus on right now, on this moment, on this evening, and this summer that we still have left. And then we'll figure out the next step when we get there. It wasn't a plan exactly. It was more like a philosophy, a way of approaching the unknown that felt both terrifying and liberating. Stop trying to control the future. Stop worrying about what other people might think or say or do. Just exist in this space we'd carved out for ourselves and let whatever was going to happen, happen. Okay, I said. Okay? Yeah, let's just be for the rest of the summer, see what happens. He smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. I like that plan. It's not really a plan. Even better. The light was fading now, and we should have been heading home. But neither of us moved. Instead, we sat by the creek as the fireflies began to emerge, blinking in the gathering darkness like stars fallen to earth. It reminded me of all those summer nights when we were children, chasing those same fireflies through the same familiar landscape. But everything was different now. We were different. Danny, Marcus said softly. Yeah? Thank you. For what? For coming home. For giving this a chance. For being brave enough to feel what you're feeling. I looked at him, at this man I'd known my entire life and was still discovering in new ways every day, and felt my heart swell with something too big for words. Thank you for waiting, I said. I would have waited forever. The last 2 weeks of August passed in a blur of golden afternoons and warm evenings. Each day precious because we could feel summer slipping away. We made the most of it, stealing as much time together as we could manage without raising too many questions. Long drives through the countryside, evenings by the hidden lake, walks through the woods that had been our childhood playground. The physical tension between us continued to build, but we'd found a kind of equilibrium in it. We touched more now, hands brushing as we passed things back and forth, his hand on my shoulder when he was making a point. The casual intimacy of people who were comfortable with each other. But we were also careful not to push too far, not to cross lines that might complicate things beyond our ability to handle. It was a delicate dance, and we'd both become expert at reading the subtle signals, when to lean closer and when to pull back, when a moment was safe and when it might tip into something we weren't ready for. It existed in the space between friendship and romance, between past and future, between fear and desire. But all good things have to end, and summer was no exception. It was the last weekend of August when Marcus brought up something that had been on both our minds, but neither of us had wanted to discuss. My mom's planning a Labor Day cookout, he said as we sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the familiar landscape of our neighborhood. The whole extended family, neighbors, friends, kind of an end-of-summer tradition. That sounds nice, I said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to this conversation. She specifically asked me to make sure you and your parents were invited. Said it wouldn't be the same without the Morrison family there. I could hear the weight in his words, the implication of what it would mean. A public gathering surrounded by people who'd known us our entire lives, all of us pretending to be the same people we'd always been while carrying the secret of what had changed between us. And you want to know if I think we can handle it? I said. Can we? It was a fair question. We'd gotten good at managing our interactions when it was just the two of us, or even in small, casual encounters with family and neighbors. But a big gathering with everyone watching and talking and speculating would be a different kind of test. I think we have to, I said. It would look strange if we didn't go. I know, he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his way of processing stress. I'm worried I won't be able to hide how I feel about you, and I'm worried that if I try too hard to hide it,